All right. Well, welcome everyone to the inaugural episode of the Slingshot, a video forum featuring sling riders and other special guests. We're hoping that as this platform takes off and becomes dominant in the market for antitrust commentary, we will attract even more special guests than the ones on today's show. But these guests are very special. I'm Hal Singer and the host. Today's panel includes Marshall Steinbaum, Wave Marshall, professor of economics at the University of Utah, Asher Schecter, editor of Project Syndicate, and Darren Bush, professor of law.
Project Syndicate.
Oh, of Project Syndicate. Did I screw that up already?
At. Not off, at.
Oh,
It's like an assistant to the regional manager versus assistant regional manager.
Are we going to stop there for an edit or are we going to go? Let's see. Sorry about that. I think you should let it go. And Darren Bush, professor of law. I hope I got that right at University of Houston and an economist. All three made recent contributions to the Sling, which you should go check out at www.thesling.org. Now, the Slingshot will tape once per month, and we'll focus on the hottest competition topics, so long as they don't involve one of my cases. Now, on this episode, we will discuss three topics: the Senate hearing on the Kroger-Albertson merger, the Ticketmaster Taylor Swift fiasco, and the railroad legislation. Let's begin with the last one, and we're starting with Marshall on railroad legislation. Now, by way of background, this week, President Biden brokered a compulsory contract between the railroads and rail workers without a single paid day off for illness. The Senate voted 52-43 on Thursday, 8 votes shy of what was needed for passage, for a House-approved proposal to give rail workers 7 paid sick days as part of a tentative contract. Now, in defense of this legislation, President Biden noted that, quote, "The consequences of a shutdown were just too great for working families all across the country, and the agreement will raise workers' wages by 24%, increase healthcare benefits, and preserve two-person crews," end quote. Marshall, is this the best outcome that Biden could have achieved? And why aren't Democrats willing to go to the mattress for labor, even if it means a shutdown?
Thanks, Hal. I'm going to start things off with a bang by disagreeing with the premise of your question. The relevant question is not whether it's the best outcome Biden could have achieved, but whether it's the best outcome that workers could have achieved or that the unions could have achieved. And I think there the answer is definitely no. The Railway Labor Act and all of the political jockeying that's happened in the last couple of weeks or even months since the agreement was negotiated in September, October, I think, of this past year is premised on preventing strikes in the industry. So the idea is this is an industry that uniquely needs to function. The threat of shutdown is too damaging to the overall economy to be tolerated as part of the give and take of labor negotiations and contract negotiations. And so there's this power given to the federal government to essentially impose a contract on one of the two other parties that may not have agreed to it, rather than, as is usual, the parties having to come to an agreement in labor negotiations. The workers, I should say the unions, really relied on the Biden administration to carry the water of paid sick leave against the companies. So they were thinking, okay, we've got a Democratic administration that's claiming to be the most pro-labor in history. They will take up our banner and not allow a contract that doesn't have paid sick leave to pass. And as have so many other interests that thought they might rely on the Democratic Party to get what they wanted, they turned out to be disappointed. It's notable that the administration won't risk a shutdown for paid sick leave because I gather what's happened is that the executives in the industry have convinced them that you can't operate the current rail system in this country and still have paid sick leave. That is, it's so dependent on exploiting workers' time, on that being the margin where there's slack in the system, which is to say like workers' bodies and health, as opposed to any of the other things where that cost more to shareholders. So it's like, okay, well, we can't get hundreds of billions of dollars in buybacks unless we can operate this just-in-time production system where workers can't take time off and consequently their health is degraded. Of course, they could just hire more workers, have more redundancy in the system, get fewer buybacks, and operate a rail network that is able to afford paid sick leave. And this is the decision that's been made in the deregulatory era of transportation going back decades. That is to say, we want lean operations rather than ones that sustain middle-class lifestyles on the part of their workers. And in order to get those, we'll lay people off and work workers to the bone in order to have that system, generate huge profits that motivate buyback. So it's basically just sort of where does the balance of power in the economy lie? The administration shows that notwithstanding all the rhetoric and hoopla about how neoliberalism is over and this is a brand new era, it still lies where it always has, at least in our lifetimes.
Well, that was good. Well, let's let Asher have a chance to grab the mic for a second. Is there anything that else you want to add after Marshall's take right there?
Sure. I mean, I totally agree with Marshall. I mean, but also I think, when we talk about Biden, right? Like Biden's supposed to be the most pro-labor president that we've had in about 70 years, right? Since at least Truman, right? I'm proud of it, right? Like Amtrak Joe, Union Joe, and yet, here he is, right? Choosing railroad tycoons, right? And hedge funds over workers, right? It's sort of unfathomable given the image that Biden wanted to portray these past 2 years, right? I think, this was like an opportunity to take a stand, right? To use the bully pulpit in a real powerful way. But, in the end, this is a betrayal of workers. But it's not anything new, right? Barack Obama, as it turns out, did something very similar in 2015, right? When he signed an executive order giving federal contractors paid sick leave and specifically excluded rail workers, right? And also the thing is about this is it's not going to work, right? This legislation may have averted a strike today, but railroads were already running on fumes, right? After decades of hedge fund ordered consolidation and downsizing and cost cuts, salaries are not competitive. Now you can't even get 4 days of paid sick leave, right? People may leave and many people may leave, right? So the outcome eventually could be very similar to the strike that Biden wanted to prevent in terms of supply chain problems and what have you, right? So, I mean, Democrats, man, right? They just never miss a chance to fumble the ball.
Darren, did you hear in that quote? I thought this would set off alarm bells for you. He said, the consequences of a shutdown were just too great for working families all across the country. This doesn't seem like the workers. I know he got the word working in there, but I think what he's basically doing is elevating the welfare of consumers over that of labor. Am I misreading? What is your take?
Well, I think he's not engaged in the worry of the workers at all. And it's not atypical in the railroad industry. If you look back at the history of the railroad industry, it is one of consolidation and merger that has been perpetuated from the Surface Transportation Board. There was an old saying when I was a justice that they never met a merger they didn't like. And there are a couple of exceptions, but for the most part, when you create that kind of concentration and this whole notion of reduced costs and consumer welfare enhancement, then you run a very lean operation, which means that your employees don't get benefits. So, and Biden has said that he's going to, somewhere down the road, kicking the can down the road, make sure that everyone gets paid sick leave. But I don't see that happening.
Yeah, it seems like we're trapped in this dynamic, and I don't know how to solve it. I have some ideas that labor is always going to be relegated, even within the Democratic Party, because where are they going to turn? And so the Democrat leadership seems to be balancing corporate interests against labor interests, and they tend to side with the corporate interests. Is there any fix to this? I don't know. I put it to anyone. How do you change the dynamic, or are workers always going to be at the bottom?
I mean, it's a little hard to see how the current Democratic Party would change that dynamic, because I think you've characterized it exactly right. Labor is part of a coalition, and it's one that the leadership of the party repeatedly finds reason to disfavor at the expense of someone else, thinking they have nowhere else to go. And, the leadership of the labor movement, such as it is pretty much fully socialized into that reality. So you see the head of the AFL-CIO basically talking the White House's book on this railroad deal. Meanwhile, opportunistic Republican candidates are out there saying this is a gross betrayal of the working class. Note the difference in terminology between working families, which is the sort of long-standing Democratic Party pollster PR firm approved locution for discussing class, versus Republican candidates saying working class, because they know that is a wedge they can drive directly into the heart of the Democratic Party. So yeah, I don't really see how it can be solved within the existing Democratic Party. And I also, I think a sort of high federal politics strategy first type of way of getting out of this is not really going to work either. It's more about the sort of dual threat of the Republicans winning over working class votes, increasingly among both white people and people of color, at the same time as, the Democrats are sort of like more and more positioning themselves as the party of upscale suburbanites, that, would cause there to be some shakeup of that reality that you noted.
Now, this is my last question on this subject, if that's okay. Darren, did you want to weigh in on this one about the political power dynamics in the Democratic Party, or should I go on?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing really quickly, which is, if you declare that labor is essential, in particular because the industry is essential, then you are taking away labor's power, where more than likely there's a greater concentration in the industry itself. And a railroad's a great example. So to the extent that what you're doing is actually enhancing the monopoly power of the industry and helping them reduce costs and keep higher monopoly rents. So that seems ridiculous in terms of this whole notion of essential workers. So I think it'll be used in the future quite happily.
So let me just ask, this is the last question, we'll move on, but is there any chance that Biden would sign an executive order saying that all federal contractors governed by the Railway Labor Act must extend 7 paid sick days to rail workers, as David Dayen and other progressives are now calling for, or is that hopeless?
I think if it was going to happen, it would have happened this last 2 weeks. Now the opportunity to do that, where it could be painted as we needed to do this in order to save the economy, has been frittered away. The other thing I wanted to say about this is, I've already talked about the sort of the long history of the Democratic Party and neoliberalism and privatization and deregulation of the transportation sector. There's been a lot of talk in this era of inflation about, worker power being the reason why there's a sudden increase in inflation, and therefore we have to tame worker power. Certainly that motivates the Federal Reserve's current policy. I really think these transportation industry conflicts and screw ups highlight that it's actually worker lack of power that is the cause of supply chain disruptions, because there's no incentive on the part of management to economize on the labor front if there's endless numbers of exploited workers who will do any type of dangerous job for anything, and that is very clearly how the railroad industry and the trucking industry and the ports have been re-engineered these last decades. So we had things that, like for example, at the Port of Los Angeles, where we had huge lines of unpaid workers, that is to say truck drivers, waiting in line for their deliveries. There's no incentive on the part of any of those companies to not have their workers wait in line, because those workers are independent contractors. They don't get paid when their truck's not full. So having people waste their time waiting in line is no skin off anybody's back except everybody's, in the form of supply chain disruptions arising from backups of that kind. And that's also how the railroad industry works.
All right. Well, let's move on now to Asher to discuss the Albertsons-Kroger merger, topic number 2 for today. Asher wrote a wonderful piece on this merger for the Sling. If you guys haven't read it yet, you should go check it out. Now, by way of background, there's a little news here. The senator spent more than 2 hours on Tuesday grilling the CEOs of the nation's 2 biggest grocery chains, Kroger and Albertsons, over the proposed $24.6 billion merger. And Kroger's chairman and CEO testified that the deal would not result in any closing of stores, warehouses, or manufacturing facilities, or lead to layoffs of quote unquote frontline workers, whatever that means. He also noted that the merged company is unionized, unlike its giant rivals, Amazon and Walmart, and that he is committed to lowering prices on day one. So Asher, here's my question for you. What do you make of the commitment not to lay off any workers? If they don't lay off any workers, and if they're promising not to raise prices, right, then why are they merging? What is the source of the merger synergy here? Do they plan to, squeeze food suppliers? And if so, is that anti-competitive or pro-competitive? Sometimes I get confused with this consumer welfare thing.
Yeah. I mean, if anyone actually believes the commitments the corporations make to get a merger approved, then I've got a bridge to sell you, and also a Facebook WhatsApp merger. And also a t-shirt with a caption, a little bit of inflation is always good in our business, which is what Kroger CEO Ronnie McCullen famously said last year. I mean, companies lie, right? CEOs lie, especially to get a merger approved. What are the consequences of lying to Congress? And for that matter, what are the consequences of lying to the DOJ or the FTC? right? When it merged with the Safeway a few years ago, Albertsons got the FTC to approve the deal by promising to sell 168 stores. So we did to a really small chain in the Pacific Northwest called Hagen, right? And ultimately, Hagen couldn't handle the expansion. It went bankrupt. And what do you know? Albertsons picked it up along with many of the stores it sold at a really nice discount. So, I mean, ultimately, we can't predict the future or know what corporate executives have in mind, but I think Errol Schweitzer at Forbes and David Dian in the American Prospect have both written excellent analysis that show that it would really be surprising if this merger does not result in squeezing suppliers, workers, and consumers. I mean, generally, you just don't do a merger like this for any other reason. And with over 60% of U.S. grocery sales already concentrated among 5 retailers, the idea that it would benefit consumers to merge the second largest and fourth largest grocery store chains and leaving consumers really just 2 options, right? Kroger, Albertsons, and Walmart. I mean, the idea that this would benefit consumers in any way, this sort of market power, boggles the mind.
Yeah, now I want to just push back gently because I'm going to play the roles of devil's advocate. But here's a quote, maybe Marshall can comment on it. This came from the merging parties, but it says, when we discuss competition at Kroger, we look at where customers are actually shopping for food and eating today and the future. Customers purchase food everywhere from Walmart and Trader Joe's to Costco and Aldi's to Dollar General, 7-Eleven, Walgreens, and restaurants even. We operate on razor-thin margins. Marshall, what I want to know is, even if you accept all this as being true, that people kind of spread around where they eat, isn't it still possible that the merger could be anti-competitive? Explain that to our audience, please. Right.
Sure. Yes, I actually, and here I have to credit Andrew Sweeting, the economist who testified in this hearing that you're referring to, who was a former chief economist at FTC, who I thought in a rather anodyne way basically laid out this point quite well in his testimony, which is that it can be the case that consumers eat at all types of places and times and still have it be true that these two merging parties merging would be more anti-competitive than just that fact that people eat everywhere would suggest. And that's because the diversion ratios between these two are higher than they are between any of these other the merging parties and any of these other ostensible options. So we had the Whole Foods, I think Whole Foods Wild Oats or something like that merger a couple of years ago, a little before my time in antitrust, but I feel like the spirit of it is still around, where the whole case came down to a market definition that carved out a subset of the grocery market that Whole Foods was dominant in, I guess. I mean, I don't know exactly what the market shares were, but they wanted to buy up this other sort of organic grocery store, and the FTC, I think, prevailed on the market definition that said, these two grocery stores are competing in a sub-market of the overall grocery market, and it's not accurate to claim that these other grocery options exert discipline or exert limitation on the pricing power of the merging parties. And I think that's true here as well. I mean, it was striking to me in sort of doing some preliminary analysis for a merger perspective about Albertsons Kroger that there's really no grocery chains left in this country that aren't part of either of the two merging parties or the sort of warehouse club big box model that are their primary competitors now, like Costco and Walmart and Target. And those latter 3 companies are, in some ways in a different market niche. I mean, I guess maybe this is less the case with Costco, but less fresh food, and where the sort of traditional grocery store, at least as we've come to know it in the United States, like those are all pretty much only owned by Albertsons and Kroger chains now. And so I suspect that those form a crucial component of households food shopping, and there would be a lot of ability to raise price and gouge households in the aftermath of such a merger.
Yeah. I mean, who wants to buy 24 hamburgers at the same time? That's the Costco requirement. Anyway,
can I just interject?
Yeah,
A few years ago, I was at an antitrust conference. The former FTC official, whose name shall not be mentioned, argued that Facebook does not have a monopoly on social networking.
We lost Asher.
Because people
that
the argument that Kroger, Albertsons, or Walmart are competing with restaurants sort of reminds me of that.
Asher, you might have to say it again because you cut out in the middle. Do you want to just try one more time?
Sure. As I said, a few years ago, I was at an antitrust conference, and a former FTC official, whose name should not be mentioned, seriously argued that Facebook does not have a monopoly on social networking because people still write letters by hand.
Yeah.
Well,
That's the argument that Kroger Albertsons will compete with restaurants for selling food to consumers.
Yeah. But what a total misconception of the relevant market. So you can go out to dinner, and that is something particularly the most food impoverished of people are going to be able to do. And Marshall pointed out the Whole Foods Wild Oats merger and the misconception perhaps that the court had there about I can get healthy food at a grocery store, and therefore the customers are exactly the same, that the customers can turn to supplies for these other stores, and that's not necessarily the case. So I think, and this goes back a long, long way. I mean, if you think about Vaughn's Grocery in the 70s and it's not like antitrust has ever gotten it right with respect to grocery stores.
Well, I would disagree with that, Darren. I think they did get it right on Vaughn's Grocery. If we had that as our merger policy, we wouldn't be in this mess.
Yeah, I meant to say since Vaughn's Grocery.
Oh, okay, yes. Yeah,
that was the last of the heyday, right?
And note, I mean, a couple of things to say in response to that. The 1968 merger guidelines were a retreat from Vaughn's Grocery. So now all the reformers are saying, oh, we need to go back to the 1968 merger guidelines because those were so much more favorable to the enforcers, lower thresholds, and making great relying to a great extent on the structural presumption. But it's like that was the agencies unilaterally putting down some of their weapons in the aftermath of Vaughn's Grocery, and I think that decision, that's like one of the decisions that the Chicago School and successors points out as being of the battle years, that encourages the growth of new business models in groceries. There's been very interesting economic historical research about innovative offerings into the grocery industry, basically because the parties couldn't just buy one another up, and so if they wanted to compete, they had to internally expand, that sort of thing. A couple of other things, or two final points. First of all, Darren, was I wrong that the FTC won Whole Foods Wild Oats? The way you said it, it sounded like the FTC lost.
Well,
I thought they won.
No, I mean, I think you're right. I think, yeah. But the market definition is still problematic.
And I mean, they're going to have to sort of do something else all over again. Whoever has jurisdiction, I guess it's the FTC over this merger as well. The final thing I want to say is there's some new interesting economic research about the effect of the growth of dollar stores on grocery availability. So what those show is that the dollar stores can get very favorable terms from suppliers of non-perishable goods, which are the higher margin goods for traditional grocery stores. And so what they do is they undersell the traditional grocery stores on the non-perishable goods, which cuts the floor out from under traditional grocery stores on their full range of offerings. So these researchers show basically that when dollar stores come in, consumers do switch their purchases to dollar stores, and grocery stores exit, and consequently nutrition and availability of fresh produce and other lower margin items in the traditional grocery industry goes away. And this is a big reason for widening food deserts.
Nice.
So what is
very uplifting, Marshall? But Darren, you go ahead, but I wanted to read you this quote that just slayed me from another Kroger quote, if I could.
Go ahead.
Just to get your opinion. But they're calling the spinoff company Spinco. I don't know if this is normal, but it just cracked me up.
When I read that, Hal, I wasn't sure if that was a joke on your part or
no. I think this is real. I think this is real. It says the establishment of Spinco, which is estimated to comprise between 100 and 375 stores, would create a new agile competitor with quality stores, experience management, and blah 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 blah. So I want to know, Darren, when we think about the efficacy of spinoffs, well, I think Asher hit this already. It seems like we have a kind of a rocky history here, right, of getting even spinoffs to work. Even the divestiture fans, right, point to the fact that divestiture is often difficult because how do you carve it up and how do you guarantee that the spinoff is going to work? I also just wanted to see what you thought about the name, and if you kind of fell for the new Agile. I thought that was a better name than Spinco, but I don't know, why don't you take it for a second?
Well, it certainly is spinning something. So look, in order to actually create a functioning competitor, and we see this a lot in other industries with like, we're going to be talking about Ticketmaster in a minute, so we'll talk about their viable competitors. But it takes a lot more than just trying to mash a bunch of assets together to try to create that viable competitor. Where is this competitor going to compete? Is it going to compete in all the markets in which the merging party is going to have greater power? Does it have access to stores? There's literature out there about the creation of food deserts because of grocery stores locking up land. In order to bar competitors from creating new entrants. So it creates food deserts. So there's a lot more than just promising pie in the sky and the sweet by and by here. And I don't think that this is worked out very well in most instances.
That's right. Well, if I could, I'd like to turn to the last topic, if that's right. And Darren just kind of previewed it. It's the Ticketmaster Taylor Swift fiasco. And there, there are some fantastic pieces I just want to get your impressions on, including by Matt Stoller and Benjamin Applebaum. Something that caught my attention in Stoller's piece, and maybe Darren, you can help me because I think you may have lived through this, the DOJ, correct me if I'm wrong, that LiveNation was contemplating entering the ticketing market to compete with Ticketmaster, but abandoned those plans upon merging with Ticketmaster. It sounds a lot like a loss in potential competition, or at least a viable theory of that. I was just wondering, was that something that the DOJ pursued in vigor? And, if not, why not?
Well, you said the word vigor.
Okay, sorry.
So if you go back
at all.
And look at if you look back at the competitive impact statement, it certainly talks about the whole notion that LiveNation was the best possible competitor to Ticketmaster and had the capacity to rival them in terms of and this is a vertically integrated industry where ticket sales, access to venues are vital. And Ticketmaster has since locked up those venues to a great degree. So yeah, they talked about it, but then at the end, they decided that there's this great competitor out there who is going to save things. And who doesn't compete in many of the markets Ticketmaster operates in.
And who was that great competitor?
It was AEG.
Okay.
And if you go to their website, you can go and check out what venues they have. And Hal, I will assure you, you're going to be disappointed in terms of your options. So if you're, and by the way, this is not a uniform market. I mean, so if there's small venues for various types of comedy venues, larger scale venues. And if you're Taylor Swift, and I know you all are Swifties, then you have to have access to those larger venues especially if you're going on a world tour. There's no other choice but Ticketmaster in that case. Got it.
And let's bring Asher back in. I don't know if you got to see this New York Times piece, but Applebaum, asked this question. I don't think he really answered it. Maybe you got an answer. He says, why do regulators keep getting tricked by these false promises made by merging parties? Right? Because there were a lot of promises that were made and a consent order entered into in the prior merger, right? Ticketmaster and LiveNation. And then I think Trump's DOJ had to go back and kind of force a redo. So what is it? Why are people kind of falling for this stuff? Do you have any theories?
I mean, sure. I mean, revolving door is one. Everybody eventually wants to leave. A lot of people want to leave the government and join the defense bar. It's much more lucrative. That's part of it, of course, sort of old-fashioned financial self-interest. I think another one is this sort of good faith belief that I think we saw, especially in the Obama era, the sort of Hamilton Democrat sort of America is great and everybody's just going to do whatever we want because we all believe in democracy or something. Really, let's just all pretend that things are just going to work out, and they will. But I think the third thing that I think was missing from the Applebaum piece, and I think this is something that we do need to consider, is something that it's what James Quack calls cultural capture, right? Which has a similar effect to the old-fashioned Stigler style of, financial self-interest type regulatory capture, but works in a much subtler way through cultural and social affinity. And I think we saw that especially in the Obama era. There's sort of regulators and the people who are being regulated, corporate executives and what have you, just belong to the same social circles and same schools, same cultural circles. They all just belong to the same group. So why would I not believe they're my peers, right? I think, when we want to look at why the LiveNation Ticketmaster remedies didn't work, usually behavioral remedies, they rarely do work. But when we think about why they believed they would, I think a big part of it is also that cultural affinity, that sort of cultural capture, where I don't need to wield power because it's just going to work out.
I got it. And that makes sense. Now, Marshall, I want to come back to you. I want to put on my my defense cap a bit, but I think I saw a law professor who will go unnamed saying, that this ticketing fiasco could have happened under a more competitive market structure. That is, it really wasn't a manifestation of the monopoly power, but instead some kind of technical snafu that would have inevitably happened whenever you kind of ram that much demand down the system. And I seem to recall you replying to said law professor on the Twitter. But I just want to give you a chance, like, how do we know if that kind of fiasco reflects a monopoly problem, right? Or was it just something that was bound to happen under any market structure?
No, I think there's different ways of allocating scarce resources, and the one where you have everyone line up online to try to get them all at once is not a particularly efficient one. And yet we have a antitrust regime that sort of presumes that kind of thing is just going to work out in the end. So it's like, okay, well, what's the best way of allocating a scarce resource? Whatever some captain of industry says is the answer to that, because we assume that competition is going to exist kind of regardless of what regulations are put in place or enforced to bring it into existence, and then that will solve any type of bottleneck problem. And I feel like this gets back to what I was talking about earlier with the transportation industry and supply chain hiccups that have plagued the economy in the last couple of years. Is like, basically that's not supposed to happen in a decentralized, deregulated capitalistic market, and yet it does because the principals don't have any incentive to economize on the scarce resource, in this case, people's time that they're not being paid for. And I think the same work goes for consumers in the case of the ticketing fiasco.
Well, I'll jump in here because there's a couple of things about the ticketing fiasco that I think might be deliberate. I said might be. So, for example, Ticketmaster does have a position in aftermarket sales, does it not?
Yeah, I was going to ask that because it seems like so ridiculous that we assume that's not the case, and yet the thread that you're referring to definitely did.
Yeah, and so if they have a position in aftermarket sales, and you actually constrain the position in the first market, and because tickets are a perishable good, right? So, I can create scarcity, and then I can enhance it on the back end. The other thing I want to point out is what you said earlier about Whole Foods and Wild Oats. When the FTC entered a consent decree, you said they won that case, and so in the same fashion, DOJ won the Ticketmaster case. They entered a consent decree, and so if that's considered a win, then this is a win for the government. And so this is the big problem with merger settlements. The DOJ won. And so consumers are better off, and you're all experiencing that now. And me too, as a Swiftie.
Now, Darren, when you were at the DOJ, right? But were you not there over this period? Ticketmaster?
No, I predated that.
Oh, you did? Okay. Well, you're dating yourself. But I'm just curious, we're wrapping up this show. We're going to maybe need some celebrity economists for the next show. Do you happen to know who the economists were who peddled that thing through the agencies? Maybe we should invite him or her onto the show next month. Sorry,
I honestly don't know. And if I did, I probably wouldn't just call them out like here.
Okay.
But, I'm already well loved in the industry. I just don't want to get further well loved.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there unless anyone is just chomping to get in one other word. Otherwise, I'll see you guys again back in a month from now for our second installment of the Slingshot.
I do have one more jump in. And
Good.
this is it. Listen to me, guys. This is it. So we need a competitor to Ticketmaster. And so I'm here to pitch to you, and this is my idea I just came up with, a brand new ticketing and venue store called Taylor's Version.
All right.
I
You
like
heard
it.
it here.
Yeah, yeah, vertical integration, internal expansion.
All right. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. But thanks so much for joining, and see you guys in a month from now.
Great.
All right, take
Okay.
care.
Bye-bye.
All right.